BBC. Let me spell out the BBC's systematic failures, from airing Hamas propaganda disguised as children's testimonies to actually whitewashing Hamas as anything other than what it actually is, a terrorist group. All of these points to one disturbing conclusion: that the BBC is actively shaping the narrative to undermine Israel and to embolden Hamas. Our Deputy Foreign Minister, Sharon Haskell, has said as much in interviews over the last few days. What the BBC are doing is they are amplifying Hamas's voices while censoring Israeli suffering, giving airtime to the children of Hamas operatives while neglecting the horrific testimonies of Israeli hostages. As I mentioned earlier in this briefing, yesterday, the BBC's Sebastian Usher actually had the audacity to say that the released hostages looked in good condition. So the BBC spreading Hamas's disinformation, as seen very early on in this war with the Al-Ali hospital lie, which failed to retract with the same prominence as which they spread the lie. They refused to call Hamas a terrorist organization, a term which is actually recognized by their own government, while portraying Israel's defensive actions as a war crime. They frame Hamas's actions and Israel's defense as morally equivalent, legitimizing terror as a valid resistance. The pattern is clear. The BBC's reporting doesn't just misinform, it serves Hamas's interests. By obscuring the truth, the BBC shields Hamas from accountability and supports its goal of Israel's destruction. I've seen this many, many times, and it's very clear to many people, to I think the majority of Israelis. Even when I have personally been interviewed on days where our hostages have been released, looking, unfortunately, you're left with no other impression that they have just been released from a concentration camp. Rather than them wanting to talk about that, they prefer, BBC said to me that they wanted to talk about UNRWA. They wanted to that was what they wanted to talk about on the day our hostages were released. We understand very, very clearly what the BBC's agenda is. We know that they are funded by the taxpayer in the UK. That's British people's hard-earned money being used to finance the spreading of Hamas propaganda, and they should be ashamed of themselves. They are failing in their duty to be impartial, and they are failing in their duty to give the real news rather than news which is tainted by their own willingness to see Israel damaged in the public arena.
And let's move to the UK. The BBC's Israel-Hamas coverage is said to have breached the broadcaster's own editorial guidelines over 1,500 times. This is according to a new report compiled by a team of lawyers and data scientists. Douglas, they analysed some 9 million words of coverage across several languages and different platforms. The question has to be asked, why does the BBC have this deeply worrying pattern of bias against Israel?
It always has done. I'm slightly surprised that they've been found to have only 1,500 breaches of their own guidelines in recent months. I'd have put the figure rather higher than that. There was a report some years ago into the BBC's anti-Israel bias inside the BBC, and the report was never released. And I suspect, as many other people do, that it's because it came to the same conclusions that this report has come to. You can absolutely smell it in Broadcasting House. There's a straightforward editorial line on the Israel issue, which is that the BBC believes that Israel always is in the wrong and can do no right. And its coverage is grossly unfair. It has been for years. And I think this is something that should be addressed. I mean, you see it in headline after headline. Day after day, the BBC will report things from effectively the angle of Hamas. It happened recently with the issue of the four hostages who were killed in captivity. The way in which the BBC reported this, it was as if the Israelis had killed the Israeli hostages. It was as if the Israeli Prime Minister had killed the Israeli hostages. The whole onus of the coverage was as if there was an Israeli mistake or error or Israeli intransigence that had caused it. And the coverage did not acknowledge the fact that in most civilized media entities, as well as societies, it is deemed to be wrong to break into somebody else's country, break into their house, kill their citizens and kidnap them, then hold them in tunnels for almost a year and then shoot them in the head. Most people would regard that as being on the people who did it. But oh, not the BBC, because you can always find Jeremy Bowen or another of their correspondents always taking the side, always of just anyone who's anti-Israel. It's an endemic bias in the BBC. It's completely sick. And of course, they're welcome to do that. If they want to just be a pro-Hamas, anti-Israel channel, they can do that. But there's a caveat with them, which is that they're not in the free market. They're not an exchange of free ideas. They're paid for by the license payers, by the taxpayers in the UK. So that's why this matters. It's not like The Guardian. The Guardian can do what it wants. This is the national broadcaster. And so I think that a better standard should be expected of them and indeed demanded.
For years, Hamas has skillfully created narratives that were designed to manipulate a credulous Western press like the BBC. And I think they're always eager for emotive tales of Palestinian suffering. So this fell right into their lap. And I think the use of child crisis actors is particularly insidious. It feeds that BBC media machine that really thrives on sentimental, victim-centered storytelling. Now, you might, as you say, expect journalists, at least those deserving of the title, to see through that sort of deception. But instead, the BBC just dutifully broadcast Hamas propaganda, which was neatly gift-wrapped for Western audiences. And British taxpayers are unwittingly underwriting that spectacle. As you said, £400,000 for that documentary.
How? By the way, how did that cost $400,000?
Well, good question. And I mean, we've seen that.
What, they got gold-plated cameras? What's going on?
Downing Street said that there would be no circumstances in which it would be acceptable for the BBC to have paid money to Hamas, which some of this money might have got there. But that's rich as well, because this government's steadfast support for UNRWA has included £41 million of support this financial year. And we all know that UNRWA is deeply compromised by Hamas and its close ties to terrorism. So probably some of that 41 million of British taxpayers' money is also going that way.
Yes.
I think the point here is that there's a denial among the BBC, and let's face it, not just the BBC, much of the media. Talk's been pretty good. If I dare say their name here, GB News have been pretty good. The rest of the media in this country, it's been absolutely rotten during this entire war. And long before that, Robert Jenrick said that since October the 7th, that there's been a problem that the BBC's comprehensively failed the licence fee payer. It's not been since October the 7th. He's wrong. It's been for years or decades.
Yeah.
The BBC has an absolute blind spot, if we can call it blind spot. I believe they know about it, so it's not a blind spot. They've got their eyes firmly screwed shut. They don't want
I will go further than that, Jonathan. I would say that the BBC is institutionally racist against Jewish people. I think it's that simple. I think it's that blatant. I've had enough conversations with people who work at the BBC who are concerned, and people who just genuinely just think it's all absolutely fine. Their coverage, they have such a blind spot on the issue. They are not a biased, an impartial reporting organisation on this. I mean, it's too often that their own correspondents, their own sources that they are openly citing, are easily identifiable as people who not only are either working with Hamas, for whatever reason, but who have actually on their public postings have celebrated October 7th. If you are celebrating the massacre of Jewish innocent civilians, children on October the 7th, you have no business working for anyone in the West, let alone the BBC.
Did you see this? John Donaldson over the last couple of days, first he posted on X, the propaganda efforts by both Hamas and Israel over the hostage release are pretty nauseating. That Israel had some propaganda efforts over the hostage releases. Is this man on drugs?
Well, but also equivocate. Look, there is a propaganda aspect in terms of we get to see the images and the videos of hostages being reunited with their families and posting from their helicopters. That is all state controlled. But to equivocate the joyful release of innocent civilians or soldiers taken captive, I mean, if you're a soldier and you're being kept in a tunnel and starved and beaten and tortured, you're no longer being treated as a soldier, you're treating as a hostage. But to equivocate...
Even Jonathan took that down in the end. He said he's taken down the post about the release of hostages and prisoners as part of the Gaza ceasefire deal, as it wasn't appropriate. Sorry if it offended anyone. That wasn't my intention. Sorry if it offended anyone. Not sorry that I was massively unprofessional.
Exactly. But this thing, but the idea that in any way is equivalent morally or reporting wise to Hamas staging these just outrageous events, and the International Red Cross signing these documents and the filming of this by people, claiming to be independent journalists but clearly aren't. Al Jazeera completely and utterly in cahoots with Hamas on all of this. It is so outrageous, and it's not called out. And actually, as a guest, we had Jake Wallace-Simons on the show yesterday pointing out that every single report from inside Gaza should be, said before that, should be, nothing comes out of Gaza without Hamas approving it. This is therefore you have to do this as Hamas propaganda. But they never do that.
The thing is that there's been a lot of criticism of Israel for not allowing journalists into Gaza during the war. And I must say, I've tried to get in there myself and it's not possible. Even on their embeds, they're very strict. But I'll say this, over time, I've come to realize why. Because if you look at how easily duped some of these moronic journalists are. I mean, we saw Orla Guerin running around in Lebanon at one point where there wasn't anyone stopping them being there. She was running around the basement of that hospital where Israel had revealed publicly that Hezbollah had stored gold and money. She was running around the bit of the basement that they had allowed her to, saying, no, there's just a morgue here. It's an ordinary functioning hospital, to the point that Israel actually tweeted out the precise locations of the correct entrance to the correct building. The point is that whether knowingly or unknowingly, journalists would just end up being used as part of the propaganda tools of Hamas. And part of this war is massively a propaganda and information war.
Yeah.
So we've seen what happens when they weren't in Gaza. That is this propaganda documentary that they've made for Hamas and for the pro-Palestinian propaganda. It wouldn't have been better if they'd been allowed in. I dare say it would have been worse, because they would have been kidnapped, beaten, bullied, duped, fooled, any number of things. Israel had two very bad choices to choose between. One was to let them in and see them join in the war effort against Israel in the propaganda sense. And the other one was to keep them out and see them do it sort of secondhand from Hamas. The sad fact is that an institution like the BBC, with all its experience and money, ought to know better how to look through these things. If David Collier could figure all that out in a matter of hours after watching the documentary once, if I found, as I outlined on my X, all those editing problems. And the other thing is, if they wanted to make a documentary about the plight of Palestinian children, I've been posting on X all week images that have been coming out after the handovers. We've seen plenty of Palestinian children dancing on the stage where the coffins of children were. Whether they were forced to or not, I don't know, because it is a tyrannical, hideous terrorist regime there. Seen them celebrating, seen them holding guns, dressed in Hamas uniforms. Not one of those children was in the BBC documentary about the experience of children's lives in Gaza. And I would say that's failing the Palestinians as well, because if you don't show how they are abusing their children are the only innocents, because children don't have a say in how they're brought up or indoctrinated. And so if you see children being forced to weaponize guns or even their actions in a propaganda film, that is what the BBC as a news gathering organization should be revealing to the world. It has no commercial obligations not to do so. It could be brave, it could be bold. People ought to be fired over this. There ought to be root and branch reform of how they do their news gathering. They need to clear out any staff who are biased and not doing their job properly here, but none of this will happen. They'll find a way to do a long, boring inquiry in which they dig their heels in even more and deny.
And we'll never see the results, as happened before. I mean, again, it's just so going to be, if they were equivocating over, for instance, saying, well, the Ku Klux Klan on one side and the Black Rights Group on the other, if they were equivocating there, they'd be out on their ear. But no, it's absolutely fine when it involves Jews. And when it involves Jews, and that's the only time they've got an issue, they haven't got an issue, we call that anti-Semitism. Call that rape. Let's call it what it is. Jonathan Sacerdoti, I so appreciate you joining us, writer and broadcaster Jonathan Sacerdoti there. Claire Pissell, I mean,